The porcelain cup shattered on the cement floor the exact second Haji Okoye stepped into Mama Njeri's house. Silence swallowed the room. In the dim corner, a little boy froze beside a wooden chair clutching a silver necklace that had been buried 6 years ago with Haji's dead wife, Zawadi. The child's wide eyes lifted slowly, and Haji's breath stopped. Those were Zawadi's eyes. Not similar, not close. The same impossible softness, the same quiet storm. Then the boy took one step back, held the necklace tighter, and whispered the private name only Zawadi had ever called him. Baba Haji went cold, because his wife had been dead for 6 years, and no child should have known that name. What would you do if you walked into a house of mourning years too late, and found proof that the dead had left something behind? Tell me your country and local time in the comments. And if you love powerful emotional stories filled with truth, betrayal, and healing, subscribe and stay with me. Haji Okoye did not move for several seconds after the child said the name. The room seemed to lose its air. Dust floated through a thin shaft of late afternoon light. Somewhere outside, a chicken cried near the yard. A loose metal sheet on the roof rattled in the wind. Every ordinary sound felt cruel, because nothing inside that small house was ordinary anymore. The little boy stood with his back pressed to the wall. His tiny fingers wrapped around the silver necklace so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. The chain hung between them like a ghost. Haji knew every curve of that pendant. He had commissioned it himself in Nairobi, on the first wedding anniversary he and Zawadi had celebrated as husband and wife. Inside it, hidden behind a tiny latch, he had placed a photograph no one else knew. Existed a candid picture of Zawadi laughing with her head thrown back, sunlight on her cheek, one hand reaching toward the camera as if she were pulling him into her joy. He had placed that necklace around her throat with his own hands. And 6 years ago, standing half dead inside a cemetery he barely remembered walking into, he had watched that necklace disappear into the ground with her coffin. So how was it here? How was it in the hand of a child with Zawadi's eyes? Haji! Mama Njeri's voice broke under the weight of his name. Please, sit down first. He turned slowly toward her. The old woman stood near the doorway to the kitchen, one hand gripping the frame hard enough to whiten the skin over her knuckles. She looked smaller than he remembered. Age had thinned her face, carved deeper lines around her mouth, and bent her shoulders. But fear had made her older still. It was all over her, in her breathing, in the tremor in her jaw, in the way her eyes kept moving from Haji to the boy and back again, as if she were standing between two fires, and knew both could burn her. Who is he? Haji asked. His voice came out low, too calm. The kind of calm that frightened people more than shouting. Mama Njeri swallowed. He is a relative's child. The lie was so weak it insulted them both. Haji looked back at the boy. What is your name? The child hesitated. He looked first at Mama Njeri as children do when adults have taught them that truth is dangerous. Then he looked at Haji again. Tariq, he said softly. The name landed in Haji's chest with a strange force. Not because he recognized it. He did not. But because Zawadi had once told him that if they ever had a son, she wanted a name that sounded strong and gentle at the same time. A name that could belong to a man who protected people without becoming cruel. They had argued playfully over names during long drives and lazy evenings. She wrote favorites in the margins of books. He teased her for planning children before she was ready. She laughed and told him love should prepare a room before the child arrived. Now a child stood in front of him, and Haji could not breathe. A relative's child, he repeated without looking at Mama Njeri. Which relative, from my cousin's side, she said too quickly. They had troubles. They asked me to keep him. Haji finally turned to face her fully. For how long? A while. How long, Mama Njeri? She did not answer. His eyes moved around the room. He had entered in shock, but now the businessman in him began to wake. The man who had built an empire from fractured markets and broken trust. The man who knew that people spoke with their hands, their walls, their silences, their carelessness. If words could lie, objects often could not. The house was poor, but it was not neglected. The woven mat by the door had been repaired more than once. The curtains were old but clean. A cracked basin near the sink held neatly washed plates. Against one wall stood a narrow wooden shelf with framed photographs and folded cloth. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. And yet suddenly everything looked loaded. There was a child's cup on the table, blue plastic worn thin at the rim from regular use. There was a small pair of sandals under the bench, placed together neatly, not like the temporary belongings of a visitor. There was a faded blanket in the corner with bright stitched animals across it, lovingly repaired in 2 places. There were school letters pinned beside a calendar. This was not a house temporarily sheltering a relative's son. This was a house built around a child. Haji walked toward the shelf. "Mum and Jerry, don't," she said, almost whispering. He ignored her. The first photograph showed Zawadi at perhaps 14, standing in her school uniform, with wind lifting the edge of her skirt. Beside her was Mama Neri, younger, proud, fierce. The second showed Zawadi at university, smiling with 2 friends Haji did not know. The third had been cut, not torn by accident, cut carefully. Only half the image remained, Zawadi seated in a chair, one hand resting on what looked like the arm of someone beside her. The other half was missing. Haji stared at it. Who was cut out of this picture? Mama Njeri said nothing. His jaw tightened. He reached for a worn notebook lying beneath the frame. It was a clinic booklet. The cover was bent. The edges were soft with use. He opened it. Mama Njeri took 2 quick steps forward. "Please, Haji." He turned the first page. The booklet belonged not to Mama Njeri, not to some unknown cousin, but to a child patient named Tariq N. No full surname, no father's name. Vaccination dates, height records, notes from appointments. One page listed next of kin as Njeri M. Another page held a prescription slip folded between the leaves. And clipped to the back was a hospital bracelet. Tiny, faded, but not unreadable. Mother Zar, the rest had been smeared. Haji's hand began to shake. He lifted his eyes. "Mama Njeri," he said. And this time there was steel in every syllable. "Do not lie to me again." The old woman pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears spilled instantly, as if they had been waiting behind a dam already cracking. Tariq looked frightened. "Grandma." At that word, Haji's heart lurched again. Grandma, not caretaker, not auntie. Grandma. He crouched slowly, bringing himself closer to the child's height, though every muscle in his body felt wound like wire. "Tariq," he said carefully. "Who gave you that necklace?" The boy looked at Mama Njeri. Haji followed the glance. "Answer me." Mama Njeri broke first. "She kept it," she whispered. He stood so fast the chair behind him scraped harshly across the floor. "Who kept it?" Her tears fell harder. "Zawadi." The name exploded in the room. For a second, Haji thought he had misheard. Or maybe his grief, starved for impossible things, had twisted sound into hope. But Mama Njeri's expression told him he had heard exactly what she said. "No," he said. "No. Don't do that. Don't speak her name like that unless you are prepared to tell the truth." Mama Njeri was crying openly now. Years of fear had not made her dramatic. It had made her exhausted. "I tried to protect him," she said. "From who?" She looked at him then, and what Haji saw in her face chilled him more than anything else in the house. Not guilt, terror. "From the people who destroyed her," she said. Silence crashed over them. Even Tariq stopped moving. Haji felt as if the ground inside him had shifted half an inch small enough that nobody else would notice, violent enough to crack a building from the foundation upward. The people who what? Mamanjeri shook her head and backed away as if she had already said too much. I should not have said it. Leave it, please, please, Haji, leave it buried. He stared at her in disbelief. Buried, he repeated. My wife was buried. Mamanjeri shut her eyes. The sentence hung there, terrible and unfinished. Haji looked from the old woman to the child and back again. He suddenly remembered details from 6 years ago that grief had blurred but not erased: the rushed paperwork, the closed coffin lid, the pressure from relatives, the way Jelani had kept insisting that tradition required speed. The lawyer who had done all the speaking, while Haji himself had barely remained standing. At the time, pain had made obedience easy. Now pain was becoming memory, and memory was becoming suspicion. He looked again at the hospital bracelet in his hand. Mother Zaw. The room no longer felt like a poor widow's home in a forgotten village. It felt like the edge of a grave that had never fully closed. Haji slipped the bracelet into his pocket. Mama Njeri, he said, voice cold with decision. Whatever happened 6 years ago did not end at that cemetery. She began to weep harder. Please. But Haji was already stepping backward toward the door, his eyes never leaving Tariq. The boy clutched the necklace and stared at him with fear, confusion, and something far more dangerous than either. Recognition. For the first time in 6 years, Haji did not feel like a widower returning to the dead. He felt like a man standing at the mouth of a lie. And somewhere beneath that lie, he could already sense it, the pulse of something still alive. Haji did not drive back to the city that evening. He drove nowhere for nearly an hour. His black SUV rolled through narrow village roads lined with acacia trees and low stone walls, then onto a longer stretch of road where the red dust rose behind him like smoke. He barely saw the landscape, barely saw the women balancing baskets on their heads, barely saw the boys kicking a flattened plastic bottle beside a dry ditch, barely saw the fading sun bleeding across the horizon. His hands stayed locked around the steering wheel, his mind circling the same impossible fragments until they no longer felt like thoughts, but blows. The necklace, the clinic booklet, the hospital bracelet, Mamanjeri's tears, and the sentence that would not stop tearing through him. The people who destroyed her. Destroyed. Not lost, not mourned, destroyed. By the time he finally stopped the car, the sky had darkened into a deep indigo. He was parked outside the old roadside lodge where he had once spent a night with Zawadi after their car had broken down during the rainy season. Back then they had laughed at the leaking roof, shared roasted maize from a paper bag, and argued over whether city people like him could survive a full month in a village without complaining. She had laughed when he tried to kill a mosquito with a room slipper and hit the wall instead. Now Haji sat alone in the same dusty region, with grief returning not as sadness but as evidence. He stepped out of the car and stood beside it, breathing hard into the night air. Then memory came. Not gently, not like nostalgia, like a knife. 6 years earlier, the call had come just after midnight. He had been in Lagos finishing a brutal week of negotiations with foreign investors who wanted more control than he was willing to surrender. His phone had vibrated on the glass table beside him while he revised contract notes. He remembered being annoyed at first because he had already spoken to Zawadi an hour earlier. She had sounded tired, but Light told him not to stay up too late, told him she was visiting her mother the next day because Mamanjeri's knees had been hurting again. Before hanging up, she had gone quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something when you get back, she had said. He had smiled. That sounds dangerous. It might be. Good dangerous or bad dangerous. A pause. Then her voice lower. I don't know yet. He had frowned at the time, but an assistant had walked in with documents, and the conversation drifted away too quickly. He asked if it could wait until morning. She said yes. She said they would talk properly. She said she loved him. Hours later, a stranger's voice told him there had been an accident. The drive to the hospital had become a blur of red lights and numb disbelief. By the time he arrived, the story was already fixed. A vehicle, fire, critical condition, then death. He remembered pushing past 2 orderlies, demanding to see her, demanding details, demanding anything solid enough to hold on to. But nothing had felt solid. Everyone seemed careful. Too careful. One nurse cried without saying much. Another would not meet his eyes. Someone told him the burns were severe. Someone told him he should prepare himself. Someone told him certain rituals should not be delayed. And then Jelani appeared. That part made Haji's jaw tighten in the dark. Jelani had arrived at the hospital before dawn wearing grief like a tailored suit. Cousin, helper, organizer, protector of tradition. He had spoken gently, placed steady hands on shoulders, moved through corridors as if born to command disaster. Haji remembered hating him vaguely even then. Not for anything clear, but for the way he stepped too easily into the center of tragedy. "You are in shock," Jelani had said that night. "Let us handle the arrangements." At the time, Haji had been too shattered to fight over procedure. Now, standing under the night sky 6 years later, he wanted to hit something. He got back into the SUV, took out his phone, and called the only person from that period he still trusted completely. "Samson," he said when the line connected. The voice on the other end sharpened immediately. "Haji, it's late. What happened?" Samson Adeyemi had been head of security for Haji's group for 11 years. Before that, he had served in military intelligence. He was one of the few men Haji trusted with silence because Samson did not waste words and never mistook loyalty for flattery. "I need everything from the night Zawadi died," Haji said. "Hospital records, police file, transport logs, mortuary records, funeral authorization, any internal company communication from that week. Everything." There was a brief pause. "Why now?" "Because I think I was lied to." That silence lasted longer. Then Samson said, "Where are you in Kisembe district?" "With her mother." "Yes." Another pause. Haji could almost hear Samson recalculating the architecture of old pain and new risk. "I'll pull what I can tonight," Samson said. "But records that old may be missing. Then find the people, not just the papers. I understand." Haji ended the call and stared through the windshield into darkness. But the darkness no longer felt empty. It felt crowded. By 9 the next morning he was back in town. He did not go first to Mum and Jerry's house. He went to the district hospital. The building looked smaller than he remembered, as if time had shrunk its authority. The cream-colored walls were peeling. Rust stained the edges of old window grills. A cracked ambulance sat under a jacaranda tree like a retired witness. Nobody had bothered to move. Nurses in pale uniforms crossed the courtyard with clipboards tucked under their arms. Families waited on concrete benches carrying fruit blankets and worry. Haji walked through the entrance with the force of a man carrying years inside a single question. The records clerk, a thin, middle-aged woman with gold-rimmed glasses, stiffened when he introduced himself. Wealth had a way of entering rooms before the man did. So did grief that had learned how to stand upright. "I need the case file of Zawadi Okoye," he said. "Admission date 6 years ago. Late October." The clerk hesitated. "Older files are archived. Then retrieve it." She swallowed and nodded. While waiting, Haji studied the lobby. A child cried in the corridor. Somewhere nearby, disinfectant and heat mixed in the air. A ceiling fan turned with a clicking sound. Every sensory detail seemed to sharpen his anger, as if his mind were preparing itself to notice what it had once missed. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned with a folder. Too thin. His chest tightened. He opened it standing there. Admission form. Minimal details. Vehicle collision. Female. Adult. Burns. Trauma. Referred from highway unit. Then a treatment page. Then a death notation. Then nothing. No full physician summary. No surgical timeline. No transfer note. No photographs. No burn chart. No next of kin verification beyond a signature he recognized instantly. Jelani. Haji looked up. This is incomplete. The clerk adjusted her glasses nervously. It is what is in archive, sir. He turned the pages again slower. One line stopped him cold. Patient status updated at 0340. Reviewed by Dr. M. Biko. Below that, a death notation stamped at 0355. 15 minutes. 15 minutes between medical review and official death on a woman with severe trauma whose husband had not even arrived yet. Something was wrong. Where is Dr. Biko? Haji asked. The clerk blinked. Retired, I think. She made a quick call, then another. Finally, she looked back at him. He left the hospital 3 years ago, moved outside town. Haji slid the folder closed. I want the address. That took another 10 minutes and a favor implied but not spoken. Money helped. So did his surname. So did the way he no longer bothered to hide that he would not be leaving empty-handed. Before exiting, he turned back once more. Who signed off on release of the body? The clerk checked a ledger. Her finger stopped. She looked up uneasy now, in a deeper way. It says the remains were released to family representative. Name. She hesitated. Name. Jelani Njoro. There it was. Not a shadow now. A footprint. Haji left the hospital with the file under his arm and fury rising like fever. Outside, his phone vibrated. It was Samson. I found one thing already, Samson said without greeting. The lawyer who handled emergency notarization during that week. He didn't disappear. Haji stopped beside the car. What do you mean, he died 8 months later? Supposed carjacking. But before that, he transferred a large amount of money to an account linked to a shell company. Haji's voice went flat. Whose shell company? Samson exhaled once. The registration trails toward Jelani. The world seemed to narrow. Traffic noise faded. Voices blurred. Even the bright morning heat felt distant for half a second. Then Haji asked the question that had been forming since the night before. Samson, when Zawadi died, was I ever shown enough to identify her myself? A long silence answered first. Then Samson said carefully, No. You were shown what others said was enough. Haji closed his eyes. That was it. The first truth solid enough to break skin. He had not buried certainty. He had buried trust. He opened his eyes again and looked down at the hospital file in his hands. What had once been a wound was becoming a case. What had once been mourning was becoming an investigation. And at the center of it stood one man from the old days, smiling too easily, arranging too much, speaking too calmly, while Haji's life was burning. Jelani. For 6 years, Haji had believed he failed to protect his wife because death had moved faster than love. Now a darker thought was taking shape. Maybe death had not moved faster. Maybe lies had. By the time Haji reached Mamanjeri's house again, the afternoon heat had begun to soften, but nothing inside him had cooled. The road back felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because suspicion had burned away uncertainty. He was no longer returning as a grieving husband trying to understand something impossible. He was returning as a man who had just learned that the night his wife died had been managed by other hands. He parked outside the low fence and sat for a moment with the engine off. Children's voices drifted from somewhere down the road. A radio played faint music from a neighboring yard. Smoke rose from a cooking fire nearby. The village looked ordinary again, almost painfully so. Yet every ordinary thing made the secret inside Mamanjeri's house feel larger. He stepped out, closed the door, and went in without knocking. Mamanjeri was shelling beans into a metal bowl. Tarek sat on the floor beside her, drawing crooked circles in the dust with a stick. The moment Haji entered, both of them froze. Fear passed across Mamanjeri's face so quickly that she could not hide it. That alone told him enough. "You went to the hospital," she said. It was not a question. Haji stopped in the middle of the room. "You knew I would." The old woman lowered her eyes. "A truth like this does not stay still once it is touched." He did not sit. He took the thin hospital file from under his arm and dropped it onto the table. The sound was not loud, but it made Tarek flinch. "I have proof that the records were incomplete," Haji said. "I have proof that Jelani signed for the body. I have proof that procedures were rushed before I even reached the hospital. So I will ask you once, Mamanjeri. No more lies. No more half-truths. Who is this child?" Tarek looked up at him. The stick slipped from his hand. Mamanjeri's mouth trembled. "Haji, no." His voice cracked like a whip through the room. 6 years. 6 years I buried my wife. 6 years I thought I failed her. 6 years I thought the last words she spoke to me were the last words I would ever have. And now I find a child in your house, carrying her necklace, wearing her eyes wrapped in records that still carry the beginning of her name. Do not ask me for gentleness while you hide this from me." Tariq backed closer to Mamanjeri. The sight pierced Haji immediately. He was shouting in front of a frightened child, a child who had done nothing, a child who might know. He stopped the thought before it could finish. He dragged a hand over his face and forced himself to breathe. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Still hard, but lower. "Tariq," he said, looking at the boy. "Come here." The child hesitated. Mamanjeri touched his shoulder lightly. "Go. It's all right." It clearly was not all right, but Tariq stood anyway. He was small for his age, Haji noticed now. Slim, carefully fed, but not abundantly. His shirt had been washed so many times the fabric had softened into near thinness. There was a faint scar above one eyebrow. His feet were dusty. His chin was stubborn. And his eyes, Haji almost looked away. Those eyes belonged to too many memories. Tariq stopped 2 steps in front of him. Haji crouched until they were almost level. "Who told you to call me that name yesterday?" The boy's fingers twisted into the hem of his shirt. "Mama." Haji's heartbeat jumped. "Your mama told you," Tariq nodded. "Which mama?" The child frowned as if the question itself were strange. "My mama." Haji's throat tightened. "What is your mama's name?" Tariq answered without hesitation. "Zawadi." The room lost all sound, not gradually, instantly. Even the wind outside seemed to vanish. Haji stared at the boy, every muscle in his body turning to stone. Somewhere behind him, metal beans rolled from Mamanjeri's overturned bowl and scattered across the floor, but he barely heard them. He had prepared himself for possibilities, for hidden pregnancies, for forged records, for extortion, for madness if necessary, but not for the clean simplicity with which a child names the dead as living memory. "What did you say?" Haji asked. Tariq's eyes widened, uncertain now. "My mama's name is Zawadi." Behind him, Mamanjeri began to cry quietly. Haji stood so abruptly that the boy stumbled back. "No," Haji whispered first, then louder. "No. No, you will not do this to me." He turned on Mamanjeri. "Has he been coached? Has someone trained him to say these things?" She shook her head desperately. "No." "Then why does he speak like that? Why does he know her name? Why does he know my name? Why does he have that necklace? Because if those questions had answers, then grief itself had been altered. Then the ground on which he had built 6 years of pain had been false. Mamanjeri pressed both palms against her chest as if trying to hold her ribs together. He knows because she told him. Haji stared at her. Each word entered him slowly like shards. She told him, he repeated. How could she tell him anything if she died before he could even remember her? Mamanjeri closed her eyes. There it was again, that hesitation, that doorway she kept standing in without crossing. Haji moved toward her, not violently, but with terrifying purpose. Say it. She lived, Mama. Jerry whispered. The air left his lungs, not because he believed it instantly, because part of him had already begun to. She lived, he echoed almost soundlessly. Mama. Jerry nodded once, then covered her face with trembling hands. For a while. Haji felt something inside him split. He turned away from both of them and took 2 blind steps toward the wall. His hand landed against cracked plaster. He leaned there, head lowered, trying to understand how a human body could remain upright under that sentence. For a while, not dead that night, not gone when he was dragged from room to room by strangers speaking of fire and ritual and burial, not beyond hearing, not beyond love, alive. For a while, his chest tightened so violently he thought absurdly that this was what heart failure must feel like, not a sharp cinematic pain, but a crushing inability to accept what the body had just been told. He turned back slowly, eyes burning now. How long Mamanjeri hesitated. How long he roared. Tariq burst into tears. The sound broke Haji's fury for one awful second. He looked at the child, saw the terror on his face, and hated himself almost as much as he hated the hidden years. But the question would not release him. Mamanjeri pulled Tariq close and answered through sobs. Months. Haji shut his eyes. Months. Months. Not hours, not one miraculous night, not a few moments stolen before death. Months. All the nights he had sat alone with a bottle he never finished. All the mornings he had stared at her photographs. All the years he had visited her grave and spoken to earth. Months. Why, he asked hoarsely. Why was I told she was dead if she was alive? Mamanjeri's tears did not stop. Because they were watching. Because Jelani knew what she had found. Because she was afraid. Because I was afraid. Because she begged me not to tell anyone until she knew who could be trusted. Not anyone. Haji's voice trembled now, more wounded than furious. I was her husband. I know. No, you do not know, he shouted. If you knew, you would understand what you took from me. At that, Mamanjeri's face changed. Not into anger, into a kind of broken resolve. You think I do not know loss? She asked, and for the first time there was iron in her old voice. I buried my daughter for real, Haji. Not on that first night, but later when her body finally could not fight anymore. I watched her hold her child and cry because she believed the people hunting truth around her would kill him too if they knew he existed. I listened to her ask whether you had truly betrayed her, because by then poison had already been poured into her marriage from every side. I watched her wait for a safety that never came. Do not stand in my house and think suffering chose only you. The room went still again. Haji said nothing. He could not. Because the old woman was right, in one terrible way pain had not belonged to him alone. He had merely been locked out of the rest of it. Tariq's crying softened into hiccuping breaths. Haji looked at the child. The boy had pressed his face into Mamanjeri's wrapper, but one eye peeked out toward him, afraid, uncertain, searching. There was something in that look Haji could not bear. Recognition, not the recognition of certainty, the recognition of stories. This child had heard of him before. Not as a stranger, not as a rumor, as someone whose arrival had been prepared in words. Haji swallowed hard. Then he knelt again, but more slowly this time. "Tariq," he said, voice roughened by everything breaking inside it. "Did your mama ever tell you anything else about me?" The child sniffed and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "She said, if I saw you, I would know." Haji's heartbeat thudded painfully. How Tariq's small brow wrinkled with concentration. "She said you look strong even when your heart is hurting." Haji looked down instantly. That was Zawadi. That was her language, her cruelty of tenderness, her ability to see through his polished surfaces and say the one sentence he could never defend against. He forced himself to look up again. What else did she say? Tariq held the necklace tightly. "She said if I was scared I should say your secret name, because only you would answer to it." Haji went completely still. Babaj, the boy, whispered, almost testing it. That name had never existed in public. Not at parties, not in boardrooms, not in family gatherings. Zawadi had invented it one rainy night as a joke, then kept it because she liked the way it made him roll his eyes and smile at the same time. No one knew it. No one except her. And now, this child. A child standing in a poor house 6 years after her supposed death. Haji rose slowly, but this time there was no rage in the movement, only stunned surrender to a truth too large to reject. He looked at Mamanjeri. "I want everything," he said. "No more pieces, no more protection, no more fear deciding what I am allowed to know." The old woman nodded through tears. "There is more," she whispered. "Much more. And when you hear it, you will understand why I stayed silent." Haji's face hardened again, but differently now. "Then tell me." Mamanjeri looked at Tariq, then at the closed window, then back at Haji. And when she spoke, her next words cut deeper than all the others. "The night of the accident was not the beginning," she said. "It was the moment your wife realized someone inside your world wanted her erased." The words settled over Haji like ash after an explosion. Someone inside your world wanted her erased. He did not answer immediately. He could not. His body remained still, but inside him, everything had begun moving too fast. Old memories, unfinished arguments, stray expressions forgotten. Delays, missed calls, the subtle changes in Zawadi during the final weeks before the accident. Things he had once dismissed as stress, fatigue, mood distance. Things that now returned, sharpened by meaning. Outside, a dog barked twice and fell silent. A motorbike rattled past the road in front of the house. The world continued with its ordinary indifference, while inside that room, 6 buried years kept rising to the surface. Haji dragged a chair away from the wall and sat down at last. Not because he felt calm, because he understood this would not be a conversation he could survive standing. "Tariq," he said quietly, looking at the boy. "Go wash your hands." The child looked up at Mamanjeri first. She nodded. "Use the basin outside." Tariq hesitated, then padded toward the back door with the necklace still clutched in his fist. Haji noticed that. The boy never let go of it. Not when frightened, not when confused, not even when told to move away. It was not jewelry to him. It was protection. When the child was gone, Haji turned back to Mamanjeri. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Not from the accident. Before it. When did Zawadi know she was in danger?" Mamanjeri wiped her face with the edge of her wrapper. Her tears had not fully stopped, but the panic in her had changed shape now. It was no longer the panic of concealment. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had carried truth too long and no longer had the strength to lift it alone. She did not know at first, Mamanjeri said. At first she only knew something was wrong. Haji leaned forward. She had become quieter about 2 months before the accident. The old woman continued. "You remember that—" He did remember. Zawadi had laughed less easily in those final weeks. Not all the time. She still smiled in public, still hosted dinners, still kissed him goodbye in the mornings. But sometimes he would find her standing by the bedroom window at night, staring down into the dark garden with a look that did not belong to peace. Once he asked what troubled her, and she answered, "Nothing that will survive the morning." He had believed her because he wanted to, because business pressures were mounting, because his board was restless, because he thought marriage was strong enough to absorb temporary distance without danger. Now that memory tasted like failure. She started visiting the Children's Foundation offices without announcing herself, Mamanjeri said. Do you know why Haji shook his head? Because something did not match. Donations were rising, but supplies in the field were shrinking. Clinics that should have received medicine had empty shelves. School grants were delayed. Zawadi thought it was incompetence at first. Then she realized it was theft. Haji's face hardened. The foundation had been one of Zawadi's deepest passions. He had financed it gladly, even proudly, because it gave her something separate from his corporate empire, something humane, clean, and hers. She oversaw scholarships for girls' maternal health outreach and food distribution in low-income communities across 3 states. If someone had used that work to steal, they had not merely committed fraud. They had profaned one of the few things in his life that had ever felt morally unambiguous. Who had access, he asked. Mamanjeri hesitated. He noticed immediately. Say the names. Jelani managed local coordination for some of the foundation projects, she said. And there was a man from your company. The finance side. Mosi. Haji's jaw flexed. Mosi Adewale, his chief financial officer. Disciplined, polished, exact. A man who spoke in numbers so clean that investors trusted him almost more than they trusted Haji. He had been with the company for 8 years. He attended board reviews, signed off on audit preparations, and once sat at Haji's own dining table while Zawadi poured him tea. Haji felt sick. He worked with the foundation accounts, Haji asked. Not openly, Mamanjeri said. But Zawadi found patterns. Transfers routed through partner firms. Delays explained by one office, then contradicted by another. Jelani kept telling her everything was being handled, everything was normal, but she did not believe him anymore. Haji leaned back slowly. A scene returned to him with humiliating clarity. 3 weeks before the accident, he had come home late to find Zawadi in his study using his guest terminal. She closed the screen too fast when he entered. At the time, he had smiled and teased planning a coup. She did not smile back. Instead, she asked whether he trusted everyone in his executive team. He had answered too quickly. I trust the ones who matter. She had looked at him strangely after that, as if deciding whether he had just reassured her or failed her. That night they argued, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the chilled restraint that hurts more because love is still present beneath it. Zawadi said there were things in his business world that reached farther than he admitted. Haji said she was overextending herself, seeing conspiracies where there might only be operational mess. She accused him of being blind when the problem wore a suit and used polite language. He accused her of not trusting his judgment. Now he understood what had been happening. She had been trying to warn him, and he had defended the walls around him because powerful men are often slower to suspect betrayal from those who make themselves useful. What exactly did she find? Haji asked, his voice rough. Mamanjeri looked toward the back door to check that Tariq was still outside. Then she leaned closer. She found invoices for medicine that never arrived. Food contracts signed through companies that did not exist. Education grants approved for schools that had no students, and one private ledger copied by hand that showed the money moving out in layers. Haji's stomach tightened. You saw this ledger number. But she described it. She said if anything happened to her, I must remember 2 names, Jelani and Mosi. The room seemed to narrow around those names. Haji stared at the table. There was a part of him, a stubborn, stupid, grieving part, that still wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding. Not because the evidence was weak, but because treachery from inside one's own house always humiliates before it destroys. It is one thing to lose what you love to fate. It is another to learn people stood beside you, shook your hand, simmered in your rooms and calculated how your pain could become their opportunity. "Why didn't she come directly to me?" he asked at last. Mamanjeri's silence answered before her words did. When she finally spoke, it was very soft. "She tried." Haji looked up. "She told you she needed to discuss something important, didn't she?" His face changed. "Yes. That last phone call. That pause in her voice, that strange sentence. I don't know yet." "What do you mean she tried?" he asked. Mamanjeri clasped her hands tightly together. She had already begun suspecting that someone was feeding information from your home, your offices, or both. Her calls had started dropping strangely. Files disappeared after she copied them. One evening she found signs that her room had been searched while she was out. She became afraid to say too much over the phone. Haji felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered another detail now. 2 days before the accident, he had noticed Zawadi asking one of the staff women whether anyone entered their bedroom when cleaning was not scheduled. The maid had looked confused and denied it. Haji had dismissed it as stress. He had kissed Zawadi's forehead and told her to rest. He had been living inside smoke and calling it weather. She did not know who to trust. Mamanjeri continued. "Not completely. She loved you. That never changed. But someone had placed another poison in her heart, too." Haji went still. "What poison?" The old woman hesitated again, and that hesitation frightened him more than the answer might. "Mamanjeri." She swallowed. She was shown things. Messages, photos, a hotel receipt, a woman's bracelet left in your car, enough to make her believe you might be betraying her. Haji stood up so abruptly the chair scraped backward. "No." "She never wanted to believe it," Mamanjeri said quickly. "Even when she cried to me, she said it did not feel like you. But betrayal does not need proof when fear is already inside a marriage. It only needs timing." Haji turned away and pressed both hands to his hips, breathing hard. A bracelet. He remembered that too. Not because it had meant anything to him, but because Zawadi had once lifted a delicate gold bracelet from the console of his car and gone strangely silent. He had assumed it belonged to one of his sisters, or perhaps a guest. The driver said he knew nothing. Haji forgot about it by the next day. Zawadi had not. Then there had been that hotel receipt found in his jacket pocket after a conference trip. He had laughed in disbelief when she asked about it, because the jacket had been sent ahead by an assistant who packed for half his travel. They resolved it on the surface, but apparently not in the depths where trust either roots deeper or begins to rot. Someone had been arranging those fractures, not to break the marriage dramatically, to weaken it quietly, so that when danger came, hesitation would already be living between husband and wife. He turned back slowly. "You're telling me they stole from her foundation and poisoned her marriage at the same time?" Mamanjeri nodded with tears in her eyes. "They needed her isolated, confused, easier to predict." Haji laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Only disgust. "And I helped them. No, I told her she was overthinking." His voice thickened with self-contempt. "I told her not every shadow was a threat. I asked her to trust the very structures that were swallowing her." He felt suddenly too large for the room, too sharpened, too aware of his own blind spots. Wealth had taught him to assess markets, negotiate power, anticipate public attacks. But private sabotage. Emotional sabotage. A campaign built from small, manipulated moments inside the sacred space of marriage. That kind of cruelty had slipped through him because he still believed love once spoken was naturally defended from within. He was wrong. "Mamanjeri," he said, forcing himself back to the essential point you told me before, that Tariq might be my son. The old woman closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." Might she lowered her gaze. I know what my daughter believed. I know what I believe. But belief is not proof. Haji's hands curled. Did Zawadi ever tell you clearly? She told me there was only one man she ever wanted to build a family with. Mamanjeri looked up. But when she became afraid that you might also be hiding something from her fear, confused even the truth she carried in her own body. That is what evil does, Haji. It dirties what should have been clear. Those words hit harder than accusations, because they were true. By the time Tariq came back in carrying the blue cup and dripping water onto the floor from his wet fingers, Haji had gone silent. The boy paused in the doorway, looking between their faces. He sensed something Haji realized. Children always do. Haji crouched and opened his arms slightly, not insisting, merely offering. Tariq did not run to him, but neither did he retreat. The boy stood there, uncertain necklace glinting faintly against his chest, caught between a grandmother's grief and a stranger's ache. Haji looked at him and felt something inside himself. Rearrange not into peace, not yet, but into responsibility. No matter what the final proof would show, this child had already been shaped by lies older than his own understanding. He had grown in the shadow of theft, concealment, fear, and dead names that were not truly dead, and Haji understood with sudden clarity that the next steps could no longer be driven by grief alone. They had to be driven by truth. He rose and took his phone from his pocket. Mamanjeri, he said, voice steady now in a new and dangerous way. I am going to confirm every piece of this. She nodded once. Hospital, accounts, the people involved, and the child. At that, Tariq tightened his grip on the necklace. Haji met the boy's eyes. The child, he repeated more softly, deserves certainty more than all of us. Then he looked back at Mamanjeri. And when I return, you will tell me how my wife survived that night, and why no one, not even me, was allowed to know she was still breathing. Haji did not wait for morning. By the time the village had fallen into full darkness, he was already back in the city, sitting in the private conference room on the top floor of Okoye Holdings, with 3 files open in front of him, 2 laptops running, and Samson Adeyemi standing beside the window like a silent guard, posted at the mouth of war. The room was cold with conditioned air. Glass walls looked down over the sleeping city. Streetlights shimmered below like scattered embers. Inside that height and polish, everything appeared controlled. But Haji knew better now. Control was often the prettiest costume chaos ever wore. Samson placed a fresh folder on the table. I pulled the archived transfers from the foundation accounts that were still recoverable. Mosey signed off on only part of them. The rest were routed through subcontractors. Ghost companies, Haji asked. Samson nodded. Most of them. 2 were real firms used as camouflage. The pattern is careful. Small leaks over time. Then larger extractions hidden under emergency disbursement categories. Haji looked down at the printed spreadsheets. His eyes moved fast. Dates, amounts, partner codes, regional tags, signatures. He had read thousands of financial pages in his life, but tonight each line felt different. It was no longer about profit efficiency, risk exposure, or shareholder manipulation. This was theft from the dead, from Zawadi's children's fund, from medicine school fees, maternity aid, from every village mother who had trusted the foundation's promise, and someone had used Haji's own name to make the theft respectable. Where's the medical angle? Haji asked. Samson handed him another set of papers. More difficult. The hospital archive is damaged, but I found a retired midwife who worked the night of the accident. She refused to speak on the phone. Said if you want the truth, you must come yourself. Haji looked up sharply. We're in Mbale Township, 40 minutes east, and the ambulance driver dead. 3 years ago. Liver failure. Haji's jaw tightened. Convenient. Samson did not disagree. He only said, There's more. That phrase had become a door Haji was beginning to hate. Samson slid a phone across the table. I had our tech team retrieve metadata from Zawadi's old archived number. Most of the content is gone, but we reconstructed partial call logs from the final week. Haji picked up the device. A simple list. Dates. Times. Numbers. One incoming number repeated more than the others in the final 48 hours before the accident. Unregistered. Burned after the incident. Another line showed 3 missed calls from Zawadi to Haji on the evening before the crash. His chest tightened. He remembered none of them, because that night he had been in back-to-back investor sessions with his assistant screening calls and summarizing only what seemed urgent. If she had told him Zawadi tried to call 3 times, he had forgotten. If she had not told him, then another failure had entered the chain. What time was the accident? Reported, Haji asked. Samson checked his notes. 11:42 p.m. And her last missed call to me, 11:08. Haji stared at the numbers. 34 minutes. In those 34 minutes, his wife had tried to reach him and failed. Then the crash was reported. Then the machinery of her disappearance began. He placed the phone down carefully because sudden violence would have satisfied nothing. Get me the assistant who handled my calls that week, he said. She left the company 5 years ago. Find her. I already have. Of course he had. Samson passed over a card with a current address. Haji looked at it, then set it aside. One step at a time. Too many truths arriving at once could blur into emotion, and emotion, however justified, could still make men sloppy. He stood. Mbale first. They drove out in silence. The highway beyond the city glowed under sparse lamps before dissolving into darker rural roads. Haji sat in the back seat this time, not because he wanted distance from the driving, but because he needed the moving darkness to think. Zawadi alive for months. The sentence still tore him open each time it returned. But grief was no longer the only thing standing in him. Beneath grief now was structure, beneath heartbreak sequence, beneath pain investigation. He had spent years building companies by seeing patterns others missed. Tonight, that same instinct began rebuilding his marriage from the ruins not as romance, but as evidence. Small manipulations first. The bracelet in the car, the hotel receipt, the missed calls, the searched room, the foundation discrepancies, then the acceleration, the attempted warning, the accident, the rushed false death, the controlled burial. Then silence. A silence so complete it could only have been engineered. By the time they reached Mbale, the moon had risen over low roofs and dark fields. Samson stopped outside a modest brick house with a rusted gate and one solar lamp burning near the door. The retired midwife opened after the second knock. She was older than Haji expected, perhaps late 60s, with alert eyes that had not aged into softness. She wore a faded blue wrapper and stood straight despite the hour. When she saw Haji, something changed in her face. Not surprise, recognition mixed with dread. "You took too long," she said. The sentence struck him harder than a greeting should have. Inside the house smelled faintly of eucalyptus and starch. Samson stayed near the entrance, while Haji sat across from the woman at a narrow table. "My name is Sister Abena," she said. "I was on night duty when your wife was brought in." Haji leaned forward. "Was she alive?" "Yes." No hesitation, no softening. Just truth. The word landed like a blade and a miracle at once. Haji's fingers closed around the edge of the chair. For 1 second he looked down because if he kept looking at her, he might lose control of the expression on his face. When she arrived, Abena continued, she had burns, yes. Cuts, yes. A concussion, yes. But she was alive. She was conscious in waves. She was asking for her husband. Haji shut his eyes. The room tilted, not visibly, not enough for others to notice. But inside him, an entire year of mourning collapsed under that single image, Zawadi breathing, injured, frightened, and asking for him, while others told him she was already gone. He opened his eyes again. Did she know she was pregnant? Abena nodded slowly. She knew before that night. But we confirmed it. She was carrying a child, and the trauma triggered complications. We stabilized her as best we could, but then men began arriving. Haji's voice changed. What men? One relative. Tall, smooth talker. Expensive watch. Not grieving enough. She held his gaze. The one you call Jelani. The hatred that rose in Haji was so clean, it almost calmed him. And another man, Abena said. Corporate type. Quiet. Did not introduce himself properly. But the staff treated him as if his importance was understood. Mostly I never heard the name. But perhaps. Abena folded her hands. They asked too many questions before the doctors had answers. Not about her treatment. About who had seen her. What she said. Whether anyone had called you. Haji's pulse thudded. Did anyone call me? I tried. Abena said. Once from the ward phone. I was told your office had already been informed and that family was handling matters. Later, when I tried again, the line access had been restricted. He looked sharply at Samson. Samson's face darkened, but stayed controlled. Internal switchboard records from that year are incomplete. We'll keep digging. Haji turned back to Abena. What happened next? The old midwife exhaled slowly, as if speaking it still cost her. Your wife crashed during the early hours. Not death. A medical crash. We worked on her. We stabilized her again. The obstetric consultant decided the baby had to be delivered if either of them were to survive. Haji stopped breathing for a second. Tariq, he whispered. Abena nodded once. The child came early and weak but alive. Your wife lost much blood. She drifted in and out. She kept asking two things. Abena's eyes sharpened on him. She asked whether you knew, and she asked whether the file was safe. What file? A small envelope, protected in plastic. She would not let it out of sight at first. Later, when she weakened, she asked for her mother. Haji's mind moved fast. Evidence, ledger copies, names, proof. Did Mom and Jerry come? Yes, quietly, before dawn. She arrived terrified, and Jelani Abena's expression hardened. He was told your wife's condition was critical. He acted like a grieving cousin. But after the delivery, when he learned she was still alive, his face changed. I have worked in medicine for 40 years, Mr. Okoye. I know the face of a man disappointed by survival. A silence followed that felt almost holy in its ugliness. Haji spoke carefully. Then how was her death recorded? Abena looked at him with something like pity. It was prepared before it became true. He stared. She continued. A senior administrator ordered us to reduce access to the file. Dr. Biko objected at first. Then he stopped objecting. A death summary template was created while she was still breathing. I saw it with my own eyes. Samson swore quietly near the door. Haji's voice dropped. Why? Because someone wanted the legal world to move faster than the medical one. That sentence sat on the table between them like poison. Abena leaned back, fatigue and old anger flickering across her face. But they could not kill her there. Too many staff knew. Too many signatures would be needed. So another solution was arranged. Haji's skin went cold. What solution? Abena looked at him for a long moment, then answered. Your wife and the baby were transferred out unofficially. Hidden. Listed nowhere final. Some believed it was for protection. Some believed it was for control. I only know this: when daylight came, the woman officially recorded as your dead wife was no longer the woman lying in my ward. Haji stood. Not by choice. His body simply refused to stay seated under the force of what he had just heard. You're saying another body was used? Abena did not flinch. Yes. The room went utterly still. Haji felt something primal move through him, not just rage, not just grief, but the horror of a man realizing he had attended the burial of a lie so complete it had borrowed death from someone else. He turned away, one hand pressed to his mouth, fighting the violent urge to smash the chair, the table, the years. When he finally faced her again, his eyes had changed. Not merely wounded now. Dangerous. Who arranged the transfer, he asked. Abena's answer came in a whisper. Your wife begged her mother to take the baby and disappear, but the transfer itself was facilitated by someone with hospital authority, and someone outside who had money, reach, and a reason to erase the truth. Haji's voice became almost inaudible. Mosi. Abena did not confirm it. She did not need to. And then she gave him the final blow of the night. Your wife left a voice recording before she was moved, she said. For you. I never knew whether it survived. But if it did, then somewhere in this country Mr. Okoye the dead have already spoken. Haji did not speak during the drive back. Mbale disappeared behind them in long strips of darkness, but Sister Abena's words remained in the car like a fourth passenger. She was alive. The child came early and weak but alive. Another body was used. The dead have already spoken. No sentence loosened its grip. None softened with repetition. If anything, each return made them sharper. Samson understood enough not to interrupt. He sat in the front passenger seat. Phone dark in his palm, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the moving wash of headlights. The driver kept his eyes on the road. Outside, trucks groaned past. Motorbikes flashed by like brief insects of light. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered over dry land without yet producing rain. Inside Haji, the storm had already broken. He kept seeing her. Not Zawadi as she had been in old photographs. Not Zawadi in elegant dresses, smiling beside him at foundation launches or leaning barefoot against the kitchen counter while mocking his inability to cook anything without instructions. He saw the version he had never been allowed to witness, burned, bleeding conscious in waves, asking for him, while other people decided he no longer had the right to reach her. That image was unbearable, precisely because it was not theatrical. It was intimate, human, defenseless, and it had been stolen from him. By the time they entered the city, Haji's grief had transformed again. It was still grief. Nothing could remove that. But now grief had a spine made of names. Jelani, Mosi, and perhaps others. He went straight to the tower, not home. Home no longer felt like a neutral place. Too many memories waited there, and he could not afford to drown in them before he found what still remained alive in the truth. The executive floor was nearly empty at that hour. One cleaner pushed a cart quietly through the far corridor. Security guards nodded as Haji passed, then lowered their eyes when they saw his face. In the private office adjoining the conference room, Samson had already arranged everything on the long walnut table. 3 archive boxes, 2 recovered hard drives, 1 old phone wrapped in an evidence pouch. Haji stopped at the sight of it. The phone looked smaller than he expected, scuffed along the edges, the screen faintly cracked in one corner. It was not elegant. It did not look like the vessel of a woman's last surviving voice. Yet the moment he saw it, his throat tightened. "Where did you get it?" he asked. "From Mom and Jerry's cousin," Samson said. "She had it hidden inside a rice tin for years. He only surrendered it after I showed him hospital corroboration and signed personal protection papers for the family." Haji's eyes stayed on the device. "And it still works?" "Barely. Most of the handset is dead, but the storage chip was recoverable." Samson slid a laptop toward him. "The raw extraction is here." Haji sat down slowly. He had negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions without a tremor in his hand. He had once outweighted a hostile board during a 16-hour emergency meeting without allowing his breathing to change. But now, reaching for a laptop containing what might be Zawadi's final words, his fingers felt unsteady. He clicked open the extraction folder. Images first. Scattered photos, some corrupted. A few of Tariq as an infant, one of Mamanjeri sleeping upright in a plastic chair. A blurred ceiling, a strip of daylight through shutters. An IV stand. Fabric. Skin. Nothing complete enough to explain, but everything enough to hurt. Then audio files. 3 of them. The file names were automatic timestamps, meaningless without context. Samson said quietly. The 3rd file is damaged beyond repair. The first is only 12 seconds, mostly static. The 2nd seems intact. Haji looked at the waveform on the screen. His entire body went cold. He had spent 6 years living in the aftershock of Zawadi's silence. Now a line of blue peaks and valleys was asking whether he could survive the end of that silence. He pressed play. Pressed. At first there was only static and a rustling sound, as if the phone had been shifted against cloth. Then a weak inhale. Another. And then Haji. He stopped the playback instantly. Not because he doubted it, because he recognized her on the first syllable. The room vanished for 1 brutal second. The polished table, the city lights beyond the glass. Samson standing in patient stillness. Everything disappeared behind the raw fact of her voice. Thin, injured, breathing through pain. But hers. Entirely hers. Haji bent forward, one hand over his mouth. He had prepared himself for information. For proof. For incriminating details. He had not prepared for voice, because voice is not information. Voice is presence. Voice breaks time. Samson did not move. After several seconds, Haji straightened and pressed play again. Haji, if this reaches you, then God has been kinder than men. Her breathing shook between phrases. Somewhere nearby, something metallic clicked. A machine. A tray. He could not tell. I don't know how much time I have, and I don't know who is listening, so I have to speak in pieces. Please, listen to all of it. Haji's eyes burned. I was wrong about you, Zawadi said, and the words struck him like a confession from beyond the grave. I need that to be the first truth. I was wrong. They made me doubt you. They placed things where I would find them. They timed messages. They let me see enough to poison sleep, but never enough to prove anything. And I was proud, Haji. Too proud to come to you with half my fear and say, hold this with me until morning. She coughed. Haji flinched instinctively, as if he could reach through the years and steady her. I thought I was protecting myself from humiliation. She whispered. I did not understand that they were protecting themselves from discovery. A long breath. Jelani is involved. I am certain of that now. He has been stealing from the Foundation, not alone. There is a man in your world helping him. I only know him by what I found in the transfer trail and in the messages deleted from one office terminal. Mosi. Samson lowered his head slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Haji kept staring at the screen as though the waveform itself were a pulse. They are moving money through false partner accounts, medicine grant funds, school contracts. They thought I only cared about children and villages. That was their mistake. Mercy notices numbers too if you insult it long enough. Despite everything, despite the knife of grief in every breath, Haji felt a terrible flash of love at that line. That was Zawadi, exactly fierce, moral, unable to resist the elegance of a sentence even while bleeding. Then her voice changed. Softer, more frightened. I think they know that I know. Haji's fingers dug into the armrest. If anything happens, please do not trust the first story they give you. Do not trust speed. Do not trust paperwork that arrives too neatly. Do not let them bury me before truth catches up. He closed his eyes at that. Too late. Too late for the instruction. Too late for the warning. Too late for the man she had begged him to become in time. But the recording continued. And if... She stopped, struggled for breath, then went on more weakly. If the baby lives... Haji's eyes flew open. If the baby lives, find him. The room became silence, wrapped inside sound. He is yours. Zawadi whispered. I know that now with a certainty I should never have surrendered. I let fear speak where love should have spoken first. Forgive me for that if you can. Haji bowed his head. One tear fell onto the table before he could stop it. He is yours, she repeated. And if I do not rise from this, then do not let them teach him your name through lies. Tell him I loved him before I saw his face. Tell him I fought to stay. Tell him his grandmother knows where to find what I hid. A rustle again. Another voice far away. Someone calling softly. Zawadi seemed to turn from the phone and then back. There is a file, she said. Blue plastic envelope. Not everything but enough to begin. Names. Copies. Account routes. I could not keep the original ledger. They searched too often. Mama knows. Haji opened his eyes and looked at Samson. The security chief had gone still as carved stone. Then the final part came. And it was not accusation. Not even revelation. It was love damaged, humble, unbearably late. Haji, if you hear this, then it means I did not make it back to you the way I promised. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for every hour I spent doubting what my heart had already chosen. I am sorry I made you stand outside my fear instead of inviting you into it. But if there is still a road between your life and mine, even through our son, then walk it gently. Do not become like them in trying to punish them. Her breath hitched. Then almost inaudibly, you look strong even when your heart is hurting. I think that is why God trusted me to love you. The recording ended in static. Nothing moved for a long time. Haji sat utterly still, his face empty in the dangerous way of a man feeling too much to display any of it safely. The city beyond the glass kept glittering. Somewhere on a lower floor, a printer started and stopped. Air moved softly through vents. Time shamelessly continued. Finally, Samson spoke. We can send this to forensics and authenticate immediately. Haji nodded once, but his voice did not come. He stood and walked to the window. Below him lay the city that had called him powerful for years. Men in suits feared his decisions. Markets reacted to his moods. Rivals studied his movements. But none of that power had brought him to her bedside when she asked for him. None of it had protected the woman who trusted his world enough to move within its orbit. None of it had saved him from being turned into a mourner at the funeral of a lie. He placed one hand against the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, which was far more frightening than rage. Mosi is finished. Samson said nothing. Jelani too, Haji added. But not quickly. Not messily. I want them exposed at the exact altitude where they believed themselves untouchable. He turned from the window. There were tears in his eyes still, but they no longer made him look broken. They made him look consecrated by pain. And tomorrow, he said, we go back to Mama Neri. Samson nodded. For the envelope. Yes. Haji's gaze drifted once toward the silent laptop, toward the dead voice that had crossed 6 years to reach him. And for my son. The village was already awake when Haji returned the next morning. Women swept red dust from their doorways with short grass brooms. A donkey cart creaked past under sacks of cassava. A boy in a school sweater too big for his frame ran along the road with one shoe untied, balancing a tin lunch container under his arm. Smoke rose from cooking fires and drifted low through the brightening air. It should have felt like life. To Haji, it felt like a place waiting to witness judgment. His black SUV stopped outside Maman Jerry's fence just after 8. This time, he had not come alone. Samson stepped out first. 2 legal aides from Haji's private counsel remained in the second vehicle behind them, along with a female child welfare officer Haji had brought, not because he intended to take Tariq away, but because he wanted every next move protected from later manipulation. He would not allow truth to be stolen again by people hiding behind procedure. Maman Jerry was standing in the yard before he even reached the gate. She looked as if she had not slept. Her wrapper was tied too quickly. Her eyes were swollen. But there was something else in her face this morning, too, something close to surrender, though not in the weak sense. It was the surrender of a woman who knew the secret had finally outrun her ability to guard it. Tariq stood half behind her leg, one hand clutching the familiar silver necklace, the other wrapped around a wooden toy car with one missing wheel. When Haji saw him, the ache in his chest changed shape again. His son. He still could not say the words out loud, without feeling as though the world might tilt beneath him. Yet the recording had ended that uncertainty. Whatever legal proof still needed to be obtained, the center of his heart had already shifted. He opened the gate and walked in. Maman Jerry's eyes flicked to the others behind him. Fear rose instantly. "I did not bring them to harm you," Haji said. "I brought them so nobody can twist what happens next." The old woman gave a tired nod. Haji looked at Tariq. "Good morning." The boy did not answer. He only stared with solemn caution, studying Haji's face, as children do when they sense adults have changed overnight in ways too large to understand. Haji crouched slightly, not enough to force intimacy, only enough to soften his height. "I came back," he said. Tariq's fingers tightened on the toy car. Maman Jerry touched the child's shoulder. "Go inside for a moment." "No," Tariq said immediately. The first firm word Haji had heard from him. Maman Jerry glanced down in surprise. Haji did too. The boy swallowed, frightened by his own boldness, but unwilling to retreat. "I want to stay with Grandma." Something about that pierced Haji unexpectedly, not because it rejected him, but because it revealed the shape of the boy's world. Tariq did not resist out of rudeness. He resisted out of loyalty, out of survival. This house, this old woman, this tiny circle of safety. These were the only constants he knew. Haji straightened. "He stays." Maman Jerry looked relieved. They went inside. The same dim room, the same shelf of photographs, the same mat, the same blue cup, the same corner where everything had changed. Yet today the house felt different, not because the secret had vanished, but because it no longer stood behind silence. Haji waited until Samson shut the door before speaking. "I listened to her," he said. Maman Jerry's face crumpled. "The recording survived." Haji nodded. For a moment the old woman pressed one hand to her chest and bowed her head. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But they were not the desperate tears of hiding. They were grief mixed with relief, the grief of hearing that a dead daughter's last voice had not been swallowed entirely by time. She named them, Haji continued. Jelani, Mosey. She said there was a blue plastic envelope. Mama Nigeri gave a long, trembling exhale and looked at the floor. "Then there is no more reason to be afraid of paper. Bring it." She did not move immediately. Instead, she looked at Tariq. The boy had climbed onto the edge of the bench, still silent, still watching everyone with too much seriousness for his age. There was intelligence in that face, not just resemblance, presence. Zawadi's eyes, yes, but Haji now saw something of himself too in the way the child held still when tension rose as if learning first required observation. Mamanjeri walked to the back room. Every second she was gone seemed to stretch. Haji stood near the table with his hands clasped behind him, forcing himself into stillness. Samson remained close, but quiet. The legal aides stayed outside. The welfare officer waited in the yard. No one interrupted the old woman's pilgrimage, into the place where 6 years had been hidden. When she returned, she carried not one envelope, but a small, rusted biscuit tin. She placed it on the table with both hands reverently like something rescued from a fire. Inside were the remains of a life forced into secrecy. The blue plastic envelope, a folded baby cap yellowed with age, 2 photographs of Zawadi after the accident alive, pale scarred at the temple, holding a newborn wrapped in cloth, and a sealed letter addressed in shaky handwriting, for Haji if truth finally reaches him. Haji stopped breathing for a second. The room blurred, then sharpened again. His hand went first to the photographs. The first showed Zawadi sitting upright against pillows, thin and exhausted, but unmistakably alive. One side of her face carried healing burns along the jawline and neck. Her eyes were heavy with pain, yet they were alert. In her arms lay a tiny infant, Tariq, her fingers curled around the baby, as if even in weakness she still understood the instinctive geometry of protection. The second photograph was worse and more beautiful at once. She was smiling, a faint smile, tired and fragile, but real. Haji had to look away for a moment, not because he could not bear the damage, because he could bear the smile even less. It proved not only survival, but time. Days, perhaps weeks. Moments he had never been allowed to witness. Moments that should have belonged to him, to her, to their son. Moments stolen cleanly enough that grief had never known where to accuse. He put the photographs down and opened the envelope. Inside were copies of transaction sheets, handwritten notes, account numbers, partner names, clinic, delivery, discrepancies, distribution forms, and one page in Zawadi's own hand connecting foundation leaks to corporate shell channels. It was not the full ledger, just as she had said. But it was enough. More than enough. One line had been underlined twice. Emergency maternal outreach diversion approved through MA sub-channel. M.A. Mosi Adewale. There it was. Not suspicion now. Architecture. Samson leaned slightly closer. This is admissible with corroboration. We'll get it, Haji said. Then he picked up the letter. No one spoke while he unfolded it. The paper was creased soft from years of concealment. The handwriting drifted in places, as if written by someone fighting pain and fatigue between sentences. Haji, it began. If this letter reaches you, then it means either I lived long enough to hope again, or I died before I could return to you myself. I do not know which future you are reading this from, and that is the hardest part of writing to you. I must speak to a husband I may still hold, and to a widower I may already have broken. Haji's throat tightened so sharply he had to pause. Then he continued. First, believe this. I loved you, even when fear made me unjust to you. I am ashamed of how long I let doubt sit between us without forcing it into the light. But I need you to know that the doubt did not grow alone. It was fed. His eyes moved faster now. I found theft in the foundation records. I followed it badly at first. Too emotionally. Too privately. I should have come to you sooner. But every time I tried, I found another reason to hesitate, another sign that my phone was not safe. My room had been searched, or a new piece of false evidence had appeared against you. I began to feel I was walking inside a house where someone moved the walls at night. Haji lowered the letter briefly. That line struck with cruel precision. Someone moved the walls at night. Yes, that was exactly what had been done to them. He kept reading. If our child lives, protect him from inheritance without truth. Do not let him become a rich man's secret or a grieving family's weapon. Let him be a child first. If my mother kept him from you, do not judge her too quickly. By the time you read this, you may hate her for the silence. I ask you not to hate her before you understand the terror under which she chose it. Mamanjeri began to cry quietly again. Haji's eyes did not leave the page. I do not know how long I have. Some mornings I feel hope. Other mornings I feel my body folding away from me piece by piece. But I am writing this on one of the stronger days, and today I want to speak not as a witness, but as your wife. You were not easy to love. You hid hurt behind strength, and you mistook responsibility for tenderness too often. But you were mine in all the stubborn ways that mattered. If we have lost the life we planned, then let at least the truth survive us. The last paragraph was shorter. Do not destroy yourself trying to punish them. Expose them. Strip them of every clean surface behind which they hid. Let the world see the filth they used children, charity, and death to cover. And if there is any mercy left for us, plant something living where the lies were buried. Haji reached the end and did not move. The room had gone very still. Even Tariq seemed to understand in his child's way that the adults had entered territory too sacred for noise. After a long silence, Haji folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. Then he looked at Mama Njeri. For the first time since the truth began rising, there was no accusation in his face. Only exhaustion, grief, and a hard-earned kind of understanding. You should have told me, he said. I know. I would have come. I know. He breathed in deeply. But I understand now why you were afraid. Mama Njeri's lips trembled. I did not know how to measure danger anymore. Every decision felt like choosing which death should arrive first. That answer contained so much suffering that Haji could not argue with it. He turned then to Tariq. The boy had slid off the bench and was now standing near the doorway, toy car in hand, necklace against his chest, eyes fixed on Haji with solemn uncertainty. Haji knelt slowly. I read what your mama left, he said. Tariq said nothing. Haji held out his hand, not to take, only to offer. And she was right about one thing. The boy blinked. I did come back. Tariq's gaze dropped to Haji's hand, then to his face, then to Mama Njeri. The room waited with him. Finally, very slowly, Tariq stepped forward and placed his small hand in Haji's palm. The touch was light, frightened, real. And in that moment, even with grief still raw and justice still unfinished, Haji felt the future shift. Not into peace, not yet, but into blood responsibility and a bond no lie had managed to kill. He closed his fingers carefully around the child's hand and rose. Then he turned to Samson, his voice calm in the way that signaled irreversible decisions. Call the lawyers. Call the Economic Crimes Unit. Call the press liaison. I trust not the ones who sell angles. By tomorrow evening I want Jelani and Mosi invited to a public foundation memorial in Zawadi's name. Samson's eyes sharpened. A memorial? Haji looked down once at the photographs, the envelope, the letter, and the child beside him. No, he said quietly. A courtroom with flowers. By late afternoon the next day, the memorial hall gleamed like a lie polished for ceremony. It stood on the edge of Haji's foundation grounds in the city, a white stone pavilion with tall glass panels, trimmed hedges, and a reflecting pool that mirrored the pale gold of the descending sun. Banners bearing Zawadi's image hung from the columns. Floral arrangements lined the entrance. Rows of white chairs faced a low stage, dressed in lilies framed photographs and a projection screen, prepared to play a tribute to the woman the public believed had died 6 years ago in tragic, unquestioned innocence. Only a few people knew that by nightfall the event would become something else, not a memorial, a reckoning. Guests began arriving in careful waves. Foundation trustees, local officials, journalists, clergy, board members, charity partners, and the polished class of public mourners who wear grief elegantly when cameras are near. Soft string music floated through hidden speakers. Waiters moved with trays of water and tea. Men in dark suits lowered their voices into practiced solemnity. Women embraced with measured sorrow. Everyone spoke of legacy, remembrance, children, impact. No one yet spoke of theft. No one yet spoke of false death records, switched bodies, or the months a living woman had been hidden while the world believed her buried. At the back of the hall, Haji stood in a black suit beside Samson, watching the room fill. His face revealed nothing. That alone made people nervous. Samson leaned closer. Economic Crimes Unit is in position. 2 officers near the east aisle, 4 outside, 2 by the media enclosure. Child Welfare Officer is with Mamanjeri and Tariq in the private room. Haji nodded once. And Jelani? He asked. Arrived 10 minutes ago. Haji's gaze shifted across the room. There he was. Jelani Nyoro stood near the second row, speaking with one of the foundation trustees, his face arranged into a mask of dignified sadness. He wore a charcoal suit, a black tie, and the exact expression of a man who had practiced mourning in reflective surfaces. He even lowered his head at the right moments, as though grief were something he could fine-tune for social effect. Haji felt no temptation to storm across the room. 6 years ago he might have mistaken confrontation for justice. Not now. Justice required altitude. And witnesses. What about Mosi? Haji asked. Samson checked his watch. Just arrived. Mosi Adewale entered through the side doors, as if nothing in the world could reasonably threaten him. He was immaculate as always. Crisp navy suit, clean cuffline, measured stride. He paused at the entrance long enough to let photographers catch the angle of his face, then moved toward the front, with the contained seriousness of a man confident in institutions because he had spent years learning how to hide inside them. Haji watched him and felt something colder than hatred. Contempt. Mosi had attended strategy dinners in Haji's home. He had once praised Zawadi's integrity publicly while privately helping steal from the very work she bled for. He had likely shaken Haji's hand after the funeral while knowing the funeral itself was built on fraud. There are betrayals that wound, and there are betrayals that degrade the moral air around them. This was the second kind. At exactly 6 o'clock the music faded. A master of ceremonies approached the stage and welcomed everyone to the Zawadi Okoye Memorial Evening, a gathering honoring her life, renewing the Foundation's mission, and announcing a major scholarship expansion for children in underserved communities. His words flowed smoothly. He thanked donors, board members, strategic partners. He asked the audience to rise for a moment of silence. They did. Haji remained still at the back until the silence ended. Then he walked forward. The room changed the instant he moved. People straightened. Conversations died. Cameras pivoted. Even Jelani's carefully constructed composure tightened almost invisibly at the mouth. Haji mounted the stage and stood before Zawadi's smiling photograph. For a few seconds he said nothing. That silence mattered. It gathered the room. It forced every restless mind into his hands. When someone dies, he began his voice low and steady. The living build order around the loss. We gather. We bury. We pray. We tell stories. We trust records. We trust witnesses. We trust the mercy of ritual because grief is already heavy enough without suspicion. All eyes remained fixed on him. For 6 years, he continued. I believed I had done those things for my wife. I believed I had mourned her honestly. I believed the tragedy was fate, and my only failure was that I was not there in time. He paused. Then he turned slightly and looked straight at Jelani. But sometimes the dead are not honored by the living. Sometimes they are used. A ripple moved through the audience. Small, electric. Jelani's chin lifted a fraction, not yet in alarm, but in alertness. Mosi's face remained expressionless, though his shoulders had gone subtly still. Haji continued. This foundation was built to serve children, to deliver medicine, school fees, food support, maternal care, and dignity. Zawadi gave it more than her time. She gave it moral force. And while the public praised that work, while communities trusted it, while my wife spent her strength building it, people inside and around this institution were stealing from it. This time the ripple became a shockwave. Voices murmured. Heads turned. Journalists reached for phones. One trustee actually stood up halfway, then sat back down in confusion. At the side of the hall, Samson gave a tiny signal. Cameras from Haji's own media team began recording continuously. Haji lifted one hand. No one spoke. He had owned rooms like this before, but never with grief sitting behind his ribs like a blade. The theft was not random, he said. It was systematic. Routed through shell accounts, false contracts, ghost suppliers diverted medical disbursements and manipulated outreach records. My wife discovered part of it. She followed the numbers herself. And when she did, she became inconvenient. Jelani stood abruptly. Haji, no, Haji said, without raising his voice. You will speak when lies become useful again. For now, truth has the floor. The room went dead silent. Jelani remained standing, but he did not speak again. Haji nodded once toward Samson. The projection screen behind him flickered to life. At first, it showed ordinary foundation records, ledgers, invoices, outreach schedules, grant summaries. Then the anomalies appeared. Duplicate vendors, mismatched signatures, non-existent schools, medication invoices unpaired with delivery confirmations. Finally came enlarged transaction maps connecting regional accounts to holding entities and from those entities to two names. Gasps broke out in the audience. One line led to fronts controlled by Jelani Njoro. Another trailed through layered financial approvals toward Mosi Adewale. Mosi rose slowly this time, face pale, but controlled. These documents are incomplete and have been taken out of context. Sit down, said a voice from the aisle. Two economic crimes officers stepped into view. The audience shifted violently now. Some stood. Some pulled out phones openly. Others leaned away from Mosi and Jelani, as if corruption itself might stain fabric. Haji did not hurry. He let the room understand the shape of exposure before delivering the blade deeper. This alone would have been enough for prosecution, he said. The theft, the fraud, the exploitation of children's aid. But greed is rarely satisfied with money. It begins reaching for witnesses too. He looked again at Jelani. 6 years ago, after my wife discovered this network, she was in a car crash. I was told she died that night. I was shown incomplete records. The burial was rushed. Her body was released through a family representative before I was allowed meaningful verification. Jelani's face changed then, not into guilt, into survival. He tried to move toward the aisle, but two officers closed the angle without touching him. The room held its breath. Haji's voice did not tremble. She did not die that night. The hall erupted. Not loudly, not at first, just a violent collective intake of breath like an entire crowd forgetting how to use air. Then came the whispers, cries of disbelief, journalists speaking over one another. A woman near the third row covered her mouth. Someone in the back said, "What Mosi took one step backward." Haji went on. She survived the crash. She gave birth. She remained alive for months while false records moved faster than medicine, and while at least 2 men in this room benefited from the world believing she was already dead. Mosi finally lost control of his expression. It was brief. A tiny fracture. But those who knew how to watch powerful men saw it immediately, the flicker of calculation collapsing into fear. Jelani pointed wildly toward Haji. "This is madness. He's grieving again. He found some village gossip, and—" A new voice cut across the hall. "No." All heads turned. Mama and Jerry stood near the side entrance, one hand resting on Tariq's shoulder. The old woman looked small against the scale of the room, but in that moment she carried more moral authority than everyone in the front 2 rows combined. Tariq stood beside her in a clean shirt and dark trousers, clutching the familiar necklace. His face was solemn, not frightened now, just very still. Jelani stared as though he had seen a ghost he thought poverty would keep hidden forever. Mamanjeri's voice shook once, then steadied. "My daughter lived," she said, "and she died later after hiding from men who feared what she knew." The hall had become a furnace of attention. One journalist tried to move closer. An officer held her back. Haji stepped down from the stage. Slowly. Deliberately. He walked toward Mamanjeri and Tariq, then turned to face the audience again, with them beside him. "There is more," he said. Samson handed him a sealed folder. Haji opened it and withdrew the final document. The DNA results came 1 hour ago. He did not need to build suspense. The room had become suspense. He looked down once, just once, at Tariq, then back up. "Tariq is my son. He is the son of Zawadi Okoye. And for 6 years he has lived in hiding while men with money, titles, and access tried to erase the truth of his mother's life and death." The sound that moved through the hall then was not mere shock, it was moral disgust. People turned openly now away from Jelani, away from Mosi, away from the places they sat, as though proximity itself had become incriminating. One trustee began weeping. Another covered his face, perhaps from shame, perhaps from the recognition of how close he had stood to rot without smelling it. Jelani's voice broke loose in panic. "That child proves nothing about Tariq," suddenly lifted his head and spoke. The room froze to hear him. He looked directly at Jelani and said in a small, clear voice, "You told Grandma the baby should have died with the mother, because dead women don't talk." The sentence landed like a dropped blade. Mamanjeri shut her eyes. Jelani's face emptied, not of guilt, of hope. Because everyone could hear what had happened in that one instant, a child had repeated something no child could invent and no innocent man would ever say. Officers moved immediately. Mosi tried to step sideways toward an exit and was intercepted. Jelani began shouting, then struggling, then swearing that everything was a setup, that the papers were fabricated, that Haji was abusing power. But the more he fought, the uglier he became. Cameras captured every second. Journalists shouted questions. Trustees recoiled. The neat surfaces of both men peeled off in public exactly as Zawadi had asked. "Expose them. Strip them of every clean surface. Let the world see." As officers led Jelani and Mosi away in separate directions, Haji did not watch them long. He looked instead at Tariq. The boy had turned toward him, overwhelmed now, the courage of his single sentence already fading back into childhood. His lower lip trembled. The room was too loud, too big, too full of adult violence disguised as justice. Haji knelt in front of him. "You were brave," he said softly. Tariq blinked up at him. "Did I do bad?" The question nearly destroyed him. "No," Haji whispered. "You did what truth does. You let light in." And for the first time in public, before cameras, officers, trustees, and the collapsing architecture of deception, Haji opened his arms. Tariq hesitated only a heartbeat, then stepped into them. The house did not become peaceful all at once. That was the first truth Haji learned after justice finally stepped into daylight. Arrests made noise, headlines made noise, court filings made noise, public outrage made noise, but healing, real healing, arrived quietly, often so quietly that if a person only respected dramatic endings, he would miss it completely. 3 weeks after the memorial, the noise was still everywhere. News stations replayed footage of Jelani's public collapse and Mosi's arrest with hungry repetition. Newspapers printed long investigations into the theft ring, the false car contracting network, the doctored hospital procedures, and the failure of oversight that had allowed men in polished offices to hide greed beneath charity. Economic crimes prosecutors froze accounts. 2 hospital administrators were suspended pending criminal review. Former staff members began coming forward with fragments they had once been too afraid to share. Each new statement tightened the case. Each new fact made it harder for anyone to call the scandal misunderstanding instead of what it was, a long, deliberate desecration of truth. Haji cooperated with all of it. He gave testimony, released foundation audits, opened private records where necessary, paid for independent forensic reviews, put his own reputation at the mercy of transparency because he had finally understood a brutal principle. If lies survived by hiding inside respected institutions, then the only answer was to force every locked room open, even rooms that embarrassed him. But none of those public acts were the center of his life anymore. The center was now a small boy who still woke some nights afraid of unfamiliar ceilings. Haji had not taken Tariq from Mama and Jerry's house immediately. He refused to make that mistake. A child was not a lost heirloom to be claimed by wealth. He was a person who had already lost too much through adult decisions, adult fear, adult secrecy, and adult evil. So Haji did what Zawadi had asked in the letter. He let the child be a child first. The first arrangement was simple. Haji rented the empty bungalow beside Mama and Jerry's village house and had it repaired instead of moving Tariq straight into the city. The roof was replaced. Windows were reinforced. Clean water lines were installed. A nurse visited twice a week. A child therapist came discreetly from the district center. Schooling was arranged with a nearby private academy, but with transport that did not overwhelm the boy. Security stayed at a respectful distance, present enough to protect, far enough not to turn his world into a guarded prison. And Haji came himself. Not every few months. Not in ceremonial visits with gifts and promises. He came twice a week at first, then more often, whenever court schedules allowed. The first visits were difficult. Tariq did not dislike him. That would have been easier in some ways. Clear emotions are easier to respond to than uncertain ones. Instead, Tariq watched him with the solemn caution of a child whose imagination and memory had been built from stories before they were built from touch. He knew Haji's secret name. He knew his mother had loved him. He knew the adults around him had feared truth. But knowledge is not the same as trust. Trust requires repetition. It requires ordinary things surviving. A man says he will return on Thursday and then returns on Thursday. A man says he will stay for lunch and then stays through lunch instead of answering calls outside. A man says he will teach you how to hold a fishing line or mend a broken toy wheel or water seedlings without drowning them, and then he actually kneels in the dirt and does it. Haji learned to build fatherhood out of those modest obediences. He brought no expensive gifts at first. Just a football one week, colored pencils the next, storybooks with bright animal drawings, a small wooden toolbox because Tariq had become fascinated watching workers repair the fence. Once he brought a boxed train set from the city and instantly regretted it when Tariq stared at the glossy packaging as though it belonged to another species of child. So Haji put the box aside, sat on the floor, and helped the boy make a toy bridge from sticks and string instead. That was the afternoon Tariq laughed in front of him for the first time. The sound stopped Haji cold. It was not Zawadi's laugh, nothing so simple or cruelly miraculous. But there was something of her brightness inside the suddenness of it, inside the way joy made the child's entire face participate, instead of only his mouth. Haji smiled back too slowly, as if afraid fast movement might scare the moment away. Tariq noticed. You forgot how he asked? How what? How to laugh. Haji sat back on his heels and looked at him. Children sometimes speak with a mercy so direct, it humiliates adults. Maybe I did, Haji said. Tariq considered that, then pushed one of the wooden wheels toward him. You can do it again. That evening, when Haji drove back to the city, he had to pull over once because grief came for him, not in devastation, but in gratitude. Zawadi had not lived to see this. That wound would remain forever. But something from her had still reached him. Not only Tariq's eyes, not only her letter, not only the recording. Something of her moral clarity had crossed the grave and was now teaching him how to stay. Mama Jerry changed too. For the first month she remained stiff around Haji, not hostile but cautious, as if any sudden kindness between them might insult the years already lost. They had both suffered. They had both failed each other in ways neither could undo. Forgiveness in such cases is not a speech. It is a long practice of no longer choosing suspicion when another interpretation becomes possible. The shift began one evening after rain. The yard smelled of wet earth. Tariq had fallen asleep inside after refusing dinner and then waking to ask for it again. Haji and Mamanjeri sat on the small, covered porch, listening to water drip from the roof edge into the dark. Without looking at him, she said, "He has your habit." Haji glanced over. "Which one?" "When he is hurt, he becomes quiet first. Not dramatic, not noisy. Quiet." Haji gave a low breath that was almost a laugh. "That is not a good habit." "No," she said, "but it means he needs gentle people around him, not loud ones." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Haji said what he had been carrying for weeks. "I wanted to hate you." Mamanjeri nodded. "I know. Part of me still thinks I should. I know that too." He looked out into the rain-dark yard. "But every time I try, I see the photos of her holding him. I hear the recording. I remember what she asked of me. And I know fear had already swallowed half the world around you." Mamanjeri's eyes filled, though she did not cry. "I was wrong to keep him from you for so long," she said. "At first I believed I was protecting life. Later I was protecting the habit of fear." Haji absorbed that quietly. It was one of the truest sentences he had heard in months. Fear becomes easier to continue than to confess. That is how evil often wins its middle years. He turned to her then fully. "She died loving me," he said. Mamanjeri closed her eyes. "Yes. And she died believing I might still forgive her." "Yes." His voice dropped. There was nothing to forgive. Mamanjeri bowed her head. Somewhere inside the house, Tariq turned in sleep and muttered a word neither of them could make out. Both adults glanced toward the door automatically. That shared motion, so small and instinctive, softened something between them more than any speech could. By the second month, the legal process had advanced enough that Haji could begin the work Zawadi had asked for in her final letter. He did not simply relaunch the foundation, he rebuilt it. Half the old board was dismissed. All regional contractors were re-vetted. Independent auditors were appointed permanently. Community oversight councils, especially women from the villages the foundation served, were given voting roles in project verification. No outreach disbursement could now pass without local confirmation. Maternal aid distribution was redesigned under a program named the Zawadi Trust for Mothers and Children. Its opening ceremony was held not in the city but in Mamanjeri's village. No ballroom, no crystal, no performance grief, just a renovated clinic, a shaded field, rows of plastic chairs, mothers holding babies, schoolgirls in pressed uniforms, and a sign bearing Zawadi's name under the bright African sun. Haji stood at the podium that day with Tariq beside him and Mamanjeri seated in the front row. He did not speak like a billionaire launching a philanthropic initiative. He spoke like a man who had learned the cost of delayed truth. "We cannot return stolen years," he said. "We cannot resurrect the moments greed and cowardice consumed. But we can decide whether pain becomes inheritance or instruction." He looked down at Tariq then, and the boy looked back steadily. "This foundation will never again belong to reputation before reality. It will belong first to the people it serves." The applause that followed felt different from the applause of boardrooms or galas. It carried gratitude, yes, but also relief. Truth had not only punished the guilty, it had returned function to mercy. That evening, after everyone left, Haji stayed behind in the clinic garden with Tariq. The workers had planted young flowering shrubs along the pathway and a jacaranda sapling near the wall. The ground was still dark from watering. Tariq squatted beside the little tree and touched one leaf carefully. "Will it stay?" he asked. Haji stood beside him with hands in his pockets. "If we take care of it, what if storms come?" "They will." Tariq looked up. Then how Haji knelt beside him. "You tie it when it's young," he said. "You water it when the ground is dry. You check the roots, and when the wind comes, you don't expect it never to bend. You just help it grow back straight." Tariq seemed to think this over with grave seriousness. Then he asked the question Haji had known would one day arrive. "Did Mama love me?" The world went quiet, the clinic behind them, the field beyond, the insects beginning their evening hum. Even the air itself seemed to wait. Haji answered without hesitation. "She loved you before she saw your face. She fought to stay with you. And the reason you are here now is because her love refused to die when other things did." Tariq lowered his eyes to the little tree. After a moment he slipped his hand into Haji's. This time the touch was not frightened, not testing. It was small, warm, and certain. Haji closed his fingers around it, and for the first time in many years, he understood that healing was not the absence of grief. It was grief being given somewhere honest to live. They remained there until the light thinned into gold, then amber, then dusk. Behind them stood the clinic in Zawadi's name. Before them stood the young tree. Between them stood the child she had left in the world. And for the first time since the lie began 6 years earlier, Haji did not feel like a man walking too late toward the dead. He felt like a father walking at last toward the living. After all the betrayal, the theft, the fear, and the years stolen by silence, one truth remained stronger than all of them. Love is not proven by what we feel when life is easy, but by what we choose when truth becomes painful. Lies can delay justice. They can poison trust, divide families, and turn grief into a prison. But they cannot bury truth forever. Sooner or later, what is hidden begins to breathe beneath the ground. This story reminds us that fear may explain silence, but it does not heal it. Only courage does. Only honesty does. Only the willingness to face what hurts instead of decorating it with excuses can break the cycle. Haji could not bring Zawadi back. He could not recover the years Tariq spent growing up without his father. He could not erase the shame of having trusted the wrong people. But he could choose what those losses would produce next: more bitterness or responsibility, more vengeance or justice, more emptiness or healing. And that is the deepest lesson of all. A broken family is not always restored by returning to the past. Sometimes it is restored by finally telling the truth, accepting the pain that truth brings, and then building something kinder on the other side of it. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, what was the most painful moment for you, and what would you have done in Haji's place? And if you enjoy emotional stories about truth, betrayal, justice, and healing, subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.